The ambulance was 14 years old. You could see it from the street, the paint oxidized along the rear panels, one side mirror held in place with black electrical tape, the rear step bar worn to bare metal from years of boots coming down hard on it in the dark. It was parked in Bay 3 of Grayfield EMS station when Dr. Miriam Voss stepped out of her black Escalade and looked at it. She laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, in the way people are cruel when they mean to be. It was the quiet, laugh of a woman who had spent 30 years moving through rooms where everything was expensive and calibrated and correct, and had just encountered something that was none of those things. Her aide, Philip Crane, heard it. The two policy directors flanking her heard it. The station coordinator who had arranged the visit heard it and looked at his clipboard. The man inside the ambulance did not hear it. He was in the back, running a calibration check on the defibrillator with the focused, attention of someone who understood that the difference between a machine that worked and one that didn't was not a margin, it was a name. He had a daughter. He knew what names meant. His name was Daniel Reyes. He was 38 years old. He had been driving for Grayfield EMS for 4 years. What Miriam Voss did not know, what no one at that station knew except one person who had never said it aloud, was that Daniel Reyes had spent 11 years before Grayfield as a trauma surgeon at Johns Hopkins, that he had published 14 papers on battlefield triage and hemorrhagic shock management, that the protocol now used in 73 American emergency rooms for penetrating chest trauma had his name in the footnotes of the paper that introduced it. She laughed at his ambulance. 6 hours later, her son was dying on a table, and Daniel Reyes was the only person in the building who knew exactly what was wrong. Stay with this. Every detail was placed here for a reason. The visit had, been arranged 3 weeks earlier through the Office of the Surgeon General of the United States. Dr. Miriam Voss had held that position for 2 years, the first woman appointed to the role in a decade, a fact that had appeared in every profile written about her, always in the second paragraph, always framed as the most important thing. She was 54 years old, trained at Stanford, published in the New England Journal of Medicine 6 times, and she carried herself with the particular, composure of someone who had earned every room she had ever entered and knew it. The visit to Grayfield was part of a national infrastructure review, a formal assessment of rural and under-resourced emergency medical services across 7 states. Grayfield had been flagged in the preliminary data as a station operating below federal equipment benchmarks. That was a polite way of saying what Miriam had seen when she stepped out of the Escalade. Philip walked beside her as she moved through the station. He had worked for her for 6 years and had learned in that time to read the small signals, the half-second pause before a response, the way her pen moved against her notepad when she was forming a conclusion she had not yet spoken. He watched her move through the equipment bay and recognized the expression she was wearing. She had already decided. The station coordinator, a man named Roy Alcott, had worked for Grayfield EMS for 19 years. He walked them through the bay with the careful dignity of someone showing guests around a home they could not afford to renovate, pointing out what worked and not drawing attention to what didn't. He pointed out Bay 3 last. That ambulance, he said, had the highest call response rate in the county, lowest repeat dispatch rate, 0 missed critical interventions in 4 years. Miriam looked at the electrical tape on the mirror. She asked Roy who drove it. Roy said his name. She asked if he was available to speak with her team. Roy, said he was finishing his pre-shift check and would be available in 10 minutes. She nodded and moved on. She did not wait 10 minutes. Her team had a schedule. What she did not know was that Roy had walked the length of the station after she left and stood outside Bay 3 for a moment. He had looked at the ambulance. Then he had gone back inside without saying anything to Daniel, because Daniel would have nodded and returned to his calibration check, and Roy had learned a long time ago that, there were things Daniel already knew without being told. Daniel Reyes had come to Grayfield the same way he had come to most decisions in his life, not by falling into it, but by choosing it with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had already calculated what mattered. His wife, Sophia, had died 22 months after their daughter Lucia was born. A fast and unsparing illness that moved through her system in 7 weeks, and which Daniel, with all his training and all his knowledge, had, not been able to stop. He had stood on the correct side of the glass, the physician's side, and understood every number on every monitor, and been unable to change a single one. He had resigned from Johns Hopkins 4 months after the funeral, not because he could not perform the work. He had gone back after the initial leave and performed it with the same precision he always had. He resigned because Lucia was 14 months old and she was in daycare 11 hours a day, and when he came home, she was already asleep and he was reading her vitals instead of her face, and he understood with the particular clarity of a man trained to recognize the moment a system begins to fail that something was about to break that he could not fix from a hospital. He moved to Grayfield because Sophia had grown up there. Her mother still lived in the house on Callaway Street with the fig tree in the backyard and the same yellow curtains Sophia had described to him on their third date. Lucia knew her grandmother's voice before she knew the name of their street. Daniel sold the apartment in Baltimore. He bought a small house 8 blocks from Sophia's mother. He enrolled in the EMT to Paramedic bridge course at the regional college, completed it in 4 months, and applied to Grayfield EMS. Roy Alcott had read his application twice. Then he had called the number listed under previous employment and spoken for 40 minutes to the chief of trauma surgery at Johns Hopkins, who had said 4 things. That Daniel Reyes was the most technically precise trauma surgeon he had worked with in 30 years, that his departure had been a significant loss to the department, that whatever he was doing now, he was doing it completely and without reservation, and that Roy should consider himself fortunate. Roy had hired him the next morning. He had not told anyone else what he knew. Daniel had not asked him to keep it private. He simply had not offered the information, and Roy had understood, that the omission was intentional and had respected it entirely. Lucia was now 5 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stillness. She spent her days at the school 4 blocks from her grandmother's house and her afternoons in the EMS station break room when Daniel's shift ran late, doing her homework at the small table near the window with the focused seriousness of a child who had decided that doing things correctly was the best available tribute to a world that had not, always been correct with her. She had a stuffed bear named Patch who sat on the corner of her father's equipment bag during her visits, positioned carefully, facing the door. The policy report that Miriam's team produced on Grayfield EMS was submitted to the Regional Health Authority 11 days after the visit. It was thorough. It was accurate in the way that documents are accurate when they measure only what they can see. It recommended the station for a Category C resource review, classification that meant reduced federal allocation pending a full operational audit. It cited the age of the vehicle fleet, the below-benchmark equipment inventory, and the station's staffing structure, which it described as insufficient for the call volume being managed. It did not mention response rates. It did not mention the 0 missed critical interventions. It did not contain the name Daniel Reyes anywhere in its 41 pages. Roy read the report on a Thursday morning at his desk and sat with it for a long time. He thought about Bay 3. He thought about the electrical tape on the mirror. He thought about the fact that the tape was there because Daniel had put it there himself at 6 in the morning before a shift, using materials from his own kit, because the alternative was a mirror that moved, and a mirror that moved on an emergency run was a mirror that could cost someone a second they did not have. He thought about how none of that appeared in 41 pages. He filed the report in the folder on his desk and went out to the bay. Daniel was running inventory on the trauma kit. He looked up when Roy came in. Roy told him about the report. He told him what the Category C classification meant. He told him that the audit would take 6 to 8 months and that during that period the station's discretionary budget would be frozen. Daniel listened to all of it with the same expression he brought to most information present. Processing, not performing a reaction. Then he said, "Is Lucia's table still in the break room?" Roy said it was. Daniel said good. He returned to the inventory. Roy stood in the bay doorway for a moment. Then he went back to his office, because there was nothing else to say, and because he had learned a long time ago that some people carried things in a way that did not require witness. What happened 4 days later was not predicted by anyone. It was a Saturday, the kind of Saturday that late September produces in small, cities cool and bright, the light coming in at an angle that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Miriam Voss was in Grayfield. She had not returned for a follow-up visit. She was there because her son was there. Marcus Voss was 26 years old, a second-year resident in internal medicine at the University of Pittsburgh, home for the weekend because his mother had asked him to come and because he had recognized in her voice the specific register of a request that was not optional. He had arrived Friday evening. They had dinner. Saturday morning he went for a run on the trail along the reservoir. He collapsed at 9:47 a.m. A woman walking her dog found him on the path and called 911. The call was logged at 9:49. The dispatch went to Bay 3 at 9:50. Daniel was behind the wheel at 9:51. He reached Marcus in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. What he found was a young man on the ground, unconscious, with a pulse that was present but wrong too fast, or irregular in a specific way, a pattern that most paramedics would have read as cardiac arrhythmia and treated accordingly. Daniel read it differently. He ran the standard assessment in parallel with the secondary one, not sequentially, simultaneously, the way a trauma surgeon processes a patient, all systems at once, the full picture assembled in the time it took most people to complete the first question. The rhythm was not primary arrhythmia. It was the rhythm of a heart compensating for, or something else, a pressure building in a place that the pulse itself was trying to describe if you knew how to listen to it. He loaded Marcus, called in the status, and drove. In the back, his hands moved with the economy of someone who did not waste motion because in the situations he had trained for, motion was time and time was the variable that determined outcomes. He established access, ran the initial panel, noted 3 values and set one of them aside in a specific corner of his, or attention, the way you set aside a piece of information you do not yet have the context for but that you know will matter later. Marcus was conscious by the time they reached Grayfield Regional, disoriented, in pain, but present. Daniel gave the handoff report to the receiving team in the precise, unhurried language of clinical transfer condition on arrival, interventions performed, response to each, current status, the one value he had set aside. He mentioned the value at the end. He said it, or quietly the way he said most things. The attending physician wrote it down. He did not ask a follow-up question. He was already moving. Daniel walked back to the ambulance. He sat behind the wheel for a moment. Then he drove back to the station, restocked the trauma kit, and logged the call. Miriam Voss arrived at Grayfield Regional at 10:41. She had received the call from Marcus's phone. A nurse had dialed the last received contact when Marcus could not answer questions reliably. Miriam had, been 40 minutes away. She had made the drive in 27. She was directed to the second-floor monitoring unit, where Marcus had been stabilized and was undergoing imaging. She spoke to the attending physician for 6 minutes in the corridor outside his room. She asked every question a physician asks when the patient is also her child, questions that were medically precise and parentally terrified in equal measure, the 2 registers running simultaneously in a voice that did not allow, either one to fully surface. The attending told her what they had found and what they were watching, and what the next 4 to 6 hours would determine. She went into Marcus's room. She sat beside his bed and held his hand with the specific stillness of a woman who had spent her life telling other people what to do in medical crises and had now arrived at the one she could not manage. Marcus looked at her and said, in the dry, faintly amused voice of a young man who was scared and was not going, to say so. The paramedic called it before they ran the imaging. Miriam looked at him. Marcus told her what Daniel had noted on the handoff report, the value, the one the attending had written down without asking a follow-up question. Miriam was quiet for a moment. She asked what the paramedic's name was. Marcus said he hadn't gotten it. What followed in the next 3 hours was the particular kind of waiting that medical facilities produce, structured, monitored, populated with small actions, that create the impression of progress while the actual determination is being made by processes that cannot be hurried. Miriam remained in the room. Philip had arrived and stationed himself outside the door. The regional hospital's chief of medicine had been notified of her presence and had come to speak with her personally, which she had appreciated in a distant way that did not change anything. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the attending physician came into the room. He sat down. The imaging had, confirmed the initial assessment, but there was a secondary finding, a complication that had been developing beneath the primary presentation, quiet, structurally significant, the kind of finding that explained the pattern the paramedic had noted on arrival. The attending said they were going to need to go in. He said they had a capable surgical team on staff. He said he wanted to be honest with her about one thing. The secondary finding was a presentation he had seen twice in his career. It, was rare. The surgical approach it required was described in the literature but was not a procedure his team performed with regularity. He had looked at the relevant protocols in the last 20 minutes. He was confident in his team. He wanted her to know that he had looked. Miriam sat with that, she said. Who performed the procedure the last time it was done successfully in this region? The attending was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would find out. He came back 11 minutes later. He stood in the doorway. He said the name. Roy Alcott received the call at 1:38 in the afternoon. He listened to the attending physician's request. He did not speak for several seconds after it was finished. Then he said he understood and that he would make the call. He walked to the bay. Daniel was doing his post-shift equipment check. He looked up when Roy came in. Roy told him what the attending had said. He told him what the procedure was. He told him who the patient was. Daniel was quiet. He set down the equipment he was holding with the slow deliberateness of someone who was processing several things simultaneously and needed his hands to be still while he did it. Then he asked Roy one question. He asked if Lucia was still at her grandmother's. Roy said yes. Daniel picked up his kit. He arrived at Grayfield Regional at 1:54. He was wearing the same dark work pants and gray shirt he had worn on the morning call. He carried his bag over one shoulder. He walked through the main entrance and took the elevator to the second floor and found the attending physician waiting for him in the corridor outside the surgical suite. They spoke for 4 minutes. The attending walked him through the imaging, the current status, the secondary finding in full. Daniel asked 2 questions, both precise, both about anatomical specifics that the attending answered without hesitation and without, until afterward, fully registering the nature of what had just been asked. Then Daniel asked to see the patient. Miriam Voss was standing at the window when the door opened. She turned. She looked at the man in the doorway for 1 full second. She recognized the station. She recognized the shift. She remembered the ambulance in Bay 3 and the sound that had come out of her mouth when she saw it. She remembered moving on. She remembered not waiting 10 minutes. Daniel looked at her the way he looked at most things, with the complete, unperformed attention of someone who had already decided what was relevant and had organized himself around it. He said, "I'd like to speak with your son." She stepped aside. He crossed to the bed. He sat in the chair beside it, the same chair she had occupied for 3 hours, and he spoke to Marcus the way he had spoken to every patient in 11 years of trauma surgery directly, without softening the information, but with a quality of presence that made the directness feel like care rather than distance. He explained what he had found on the initial call. He explained what the imaging had confirmed. He explained what the procedure would involve, and what his hands would be doing and why, and what the expected recovery looked like if it went as he anticipated. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he said, "You were the paramedic." Daniel said yes. Marcus said, "You called it on the trail," Daniel said. "I had more time with you than the imaging did." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he said he was ready. Miriam was in the corridor when Daniel came out to speak with the attending. She heard him use terminology that she recognized, not the terminology of a paramedic, not the clinical shorthand of an EMT, but the specific, precise, economical language of a surgical specialist who had operated inside the problem he was now proposing to solve. She said his name. He looked at her. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm the paramedic from Bay 3, she said. "That's not what I'm asking." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, without elaboration and without any particular weight on the words, the name of the institution and the department and the years. She stood in the corridor of a regional hospital in a small city and looked at the man who had driven the ambulance she had laughed at, and understood with a precision that her training had always been very good at providing exactly what she had done and exactly what it had cost her to do it. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Please take care of my son," he said. "That's why I'm here." He went through the door. The procedure lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. Miriam sat in the family waiting area on the second floor with Philip 2 chairs away and her hands folded in her lap, in the particular stillness of a person who has relinquished control to someone else and is doing the work of trusting that decision. She did not make calls. She did not review documents. She did not do the thing she normally did in waiting, which was to occupy the space with the appearance of productivity so that the waiting itself became invisible. She sat. She thought about the report, the 41 pages, the Category C classification, the ambulance in Bay 3 and the electrical tape on the mirror, and the sound she had made standing on a parking lot in the morning light, and the man inside the vehicle who had not heard her. She thought about Marcus on the trail. She thought about 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She thought about a value noted on, A handoff report in the unhurried language of someone who had seen the full picture when everyone else was still assembling the first frame. She thought about what Roy Alcott had said and had not said when he walked them through the station. She thought about what she had not asked. At 4:22 in the afternoon, the attending physician came through the door. He sat down across from her. He said it had gone well. He said the secondary complication had been addressed completely. He said Daniel's approach had been, in his words, the most efficient surgical decision-making he had observed in this facility in 11 years of practice, and that he intended to write a case note because the adaptation Daniel had made to the standard protocol in response to the specific anatomical presentation was something the literature had not yet described. Miriam absorbed this. She asked if she could see her son. He said in 30 minutes. She stood at the window at the end of the corridor for those 30 minutes. The city ran its usual Saturday afternoon outside, unhurried, unaware, the ordinary world that did not slow down for the things that happened inside buildings. Marcus was awake when she came in. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been through something significant and has arrived on the other side of it and is taking inventory. She sat beside him. She held his hand. For a while neither of them spoke, and in the silence she could hear her own breathing in the monitor beside the bed and the soft sound of the corridor outside and something underneath all of it that was not a sound exactly but a quality, the specific texture of a moment that had almost been different and was not. Marcus said. He stayed. She looked at him. Marcus said that after the procedure, before he had been transferred back to the room, Daniel had been beside the table when the anesthesia cleared, that he had said 3 words, "You did well," and then he had picked up his bag and left. Miriam sat with that for a moment. Then she asked Marcus what he had been like in the room before. Marcus thought about it, he said. Like someone who had done the thing he was doing 1,000 times and found the repetition neither tedious nor remarkable. Like someone who was entirely present. He said it felt like being in good hands. And then he said quietly, not the way you say something to make a point, but the way you say something because it is simply accurate. He said, "I think he does that every day, Mom. I think that's just what he is." Miriam looked at the window. She said nothing. She found Roy Alcott the following Monday morning. She came to the station without Philip, without her policy directors, without the clipboard and the team and the formal structure of the visit that had preceded this one. She came alone and she asked for Roy, and when he came out to the front, she told him she would like to speak with him, and with Daniel, if Daniel was available. Roy said Daniel's shift didn't start until noon. She said she would wait. She waited in the break room. She sat at the small table near the window, the one with the worn surface and the chair that tilted slightly to the left. She noticed the shelf near the window with the child's drawings pinned to the corkboard above it, crayon landscapes, figures with round heads and stick arms, a bear that was clearly meant to be patch rendered in brown and white with careful attention to the button eyes. She sat with her hands around a cup of coffee Roy had brought her, and she looked at those drawings for a long time. Daniel arrived at 11:40. He came through the side door with his bag and saw her at the table and stopped for 1 second with the stillness of someone absorbing new information. Then he set his bag down and sat across from her. She said what she had come to say. She said she had reviewed his background. She said she understood now the full scope of what she had walked past in Bay 3. She said she had submitted a revised assessment to the Regional Health Authority that morning, reclassifying Grayfield EMs from Category C and recommending it for priority infrastructure investment. She said the Category C designation had been based on incomplete information and that the error was hers. She said she also understood that none of that addressed the other thing. He looked at her. She said she remembered standing in the parking lot. She said she remembered the sound she had made. She said she had thought about it for 2 days and that she wanted him to know she was not going to offer him a version of what happened that was easier than what it was. She had looked at his ambulance, and she had laughed, and she had moved on, and she had not asked a single question. She said that was what happened, and she was sorry. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that she did not expect. He said, "You drove 27 minutes and 11. She looked at him. He said, "I know the road. 27 minutes is the posted time." He said he had checked the call log. He said that whatever else was true, she had driven 27 minutes and 11 to get to her son. He said, "I understand that." She held his gaze and did not look away and did not say anything more because there was nothing more that needed to be said in that particular direction. After a moment, she pushed a folder across the table. He looked at it. She said it was a formal, or proposal, a regional EMS advisory position, a new role, one that did not yet exist on any organizational chart because she was creating it specifically. It would require 8 hours a month of consultation on equipment standards, protocol development, and regional training benchmarks. She said it would not change what he did every day. She said it was not a promotion or a transfer or a reclassification, she said. It's a way of making sure that the next person who reviews a station like this one, or asks the questions I didn't. He looked at the folder. He did not open it immediately. He gave it the weight it deserved. Then he said he would need to think about it. He said his shift started at noon and that he had a pre-check to run. He stood, picked up his bag, and walked toward the bay. At the door he stopped. He said, "Lucia gets out of school at 3. If you're still here, she draws at that table. She's particular about her pencils." He went through the door. Miriam sat at the small table, or in the break room of a station that was 14 years behind the benchmark on 4 separate federal metrics, and looked at the drawings on the corkboard above the shelf, the careful crayon bear, the round-headed figures, the landscapes of a child who had decided that the world around her was worth documenting precisely. She opened the folder. She read every page. Lucia arrived at March 7th. She came through the side door with her backpack and went directly to the shelf where Patch was waiting. She, or picked him up, checked him over with the brief professional assessment of someone ensuring that all conditions were as left, and set him back in his position facing the door. Then she sat down at the table, opened her bag, and took out her pencils in the particular order she always took them out, arranging them along the edge of the table with a precision that had nothing to do with anyone, watching and everything to do with the way she had learned from the person who raised her that things done, or correctly, felt different from things done approximately. She looked up at Miriam. She said, "Are you a friend of my dad's?" Miriam looked at the girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stillness and the bear with the button eyes positioned at the door. She said, "I'm working on it." Lucia considered this with the seriousness that the answer deserved. Then she selected a pencil brown, the particular brown of careful things, and began to draw. Down the corridor, in Bay 3, Daniel Reyes ran, or his pre-shift check on an ambulance that was 14 years old, with electrical tape on one mirror and a defibrillator calibrated to a tolerance that exceeded the federal standard by a margin that appeared in no report and impressed no visitors, and had, on a trail by a reservoir on a bright September morning, and exactly the difference.